By the early 1920s, Churchill's marked out Gandhi as a really dangerous troublemaker. He wants Gandhi deported from India, and he's quite blatant in some of his comments. At one dinner party, he says with a sort of flippant brutality, he says that Gandhi should be trampled by an elephant ridden by the Viceroy of India.
Welcome to Creating Churchill, an alternative biography of soldier, journalist, war leader and greatest Briton, Winston Churchill. His story has been told so many times, his bulldog image has become so familiar, that today Churchill can seem more meme than man. So this podcast series aims to get closer to the real Churchill, seeing him once again as his contemporaries saw him, the people he collaborated or clashed with. I'm Russell Barnes, and I'm talking with historian David Reynolds, exploring how Churchill's life and character were shaped by relationships with friends, rivals, enemies, and family. In this episode, Winston Churchill's spiky relationship with the Indian nationalist Mohandas Gandhi. It's a relationship that shows up some of Churchill's blind spots, often finding himself on the wrong side of history, as we might say today. Churchill notoriously described Gandhi in 1931 as a seditious Middle Temple lawyer, now posing as a fakir of a well-known type in the East, striding half-naked up the steps of the Vice Regal palace. I started by asking David why Gandhi was such a bugbear for Churchill.
Yeah, well, Churchill loved talking for effect, sometimes exaggerating, dramatizing, but his sneers about Gandhi were not forgotten or forgiven in India. There's really a pungency, almost a nastiness to this jibe. To my mind, it echoes those comments about the Bolsheviks as baboons and vermin, unusually vitriolic language. And I think his visceral loathing of Gandhi was genuine because Gandhi threatened the basic values that Churchill held dear: king, country, empire, and manliness. And in the 1930s, I think Churchill really saw Gandhi alongside Hitler as the two most dangerous threats to Britain's global position. And the problem is that Gandhi didn't play the familiar game of war and peace. His creed of non-violence could not be overcome by force. And Gandhi, as we'll see, really mobilized the kind of power that Churchill never dreamed of holding. And Gandhi played a significant part in liquidating the British Empire at its colonial heart in South Asia.
Yeah. But do you think there's more to Churchill's attitude than just different conceptions of power and politics? I want to tackle one obvious and big question head on. Do you think by the standards even of his day that Churchill was really quite racist?
Churchill was a sentimental Victorian imperialist, as Roosevelt said. His perception of India was, I think, one that was very much rooted in the year of military service in the Raj in the late 1890s. He never saw India in the 20th century, unlike many other British politicians who had more of a sense of the way that the country was changing. Churchill was very capable of condemning specific acts of brutality and injustice by the British imperial authorities. Take, for example, the notorious Amritsar massacre in 1919. Several hundred protesters in a square were gunned down by British soldiers. And Churchill told the Commons that this was, he called it, a monstrous event without precedent or parallel in the history of the British Empire. He was also keen to speak up for India's most persecuted caste, the so-called untouchables, and also for the Muslim minority, which was perhaps a quarter of British India in the days of the Raj, speaking of them as potential victims if the Hindu majority was able to push through a bid for Indian independence. And I would say in many ways, if we're talking about race and racial animosities, that Churchill's specific animosities directed at Hindus and Hinduism. He regards them as corrupt and effeminate, and he repeatedly praises Muslims and Sikhs as what he calls the martial races. They're the ones who fight for Britain's empire, and the Indian army was enormously important for Britain in the Middle East, in the First World War and the Second World War. So I think that that's how you break down this sense of races and racism. His deepest concern, of course, is geopolitical. He sees the empire as fundamental to Britain's position as a world power, and he has no doubt about the superiority of what he calls the white race and its civilization. And he goes out of his way to praise what the British have done. There's a draft speech in 1943, where he claims that for the last 80 years or so, since the so-called Indian Mutiny, India has been at peace at a time when Europe has been racked by two devastating wars, when America has gone through the appalling civil war that it fought in the 1860s, that this period of peace in India is, says Churchill, one of the noblest works that any European nation or white race has ever accomplished. Basically, Churchill simply did not believe that the Indians were capable of running India. That was an absolutely fixed idea in his mind.
Okay, so back to the beginning. Who was Gandhi? How did he come to prominence?
Well, he's a man who trains as a barrister in London, and some of the photographs of him at the beginning of in the 1890s show him as really rather a natty dresser. He's in nice suits and ties and well-trimmed moustache, and he's called to the bar in 1891. He acts as a lawyer for an Indian trader in Durban out in South Africa, and out there he becomes a political activist. He's fighting against discriminatory treatment of the Indian population because, we sometimes forget that after the abolition of the slave trade from the West Indies and Africa, Indian indentured labour was a vital part of the British Empire's economy, and these people were often really badly treated. So Gandhi takes up their cause in South Africa. And at this stage, he's not talking about Indian independence or anything like that. He's just talking about equal rights and fair treatment of the sort that he believed Queen Victoria had promised the Raj after the Indian Mutiny, as it was called, had been suppressed in 1857, 1858. So he had a real faith in what he thought of as Britain's moral empire. And during the Boer War in South Africa in 1901, Gandhi's keen to show that his support for Indians and fair treatment for Indians is not incompatible with his loyalty to the crown. So he actually raises a unit of Indian stretcher bearers to support British troops.
Right. And it's not long after the Boer War that he and Churchill have their one and only meeting.
Yes, it's poignant, isn't it, really? That's for a man that is so significant in Churchill's life, there's one occasion only, and it's a minor one, really. Churchill was Undersecretary at the Colonial Office from 1905 to 1908. He took seriously the place of the Indians in the empire. He certainly wanted to see them involved in, for example, the Legislative Council in East Africa. But in South Africa itself, his priority after the Boer War was to placate the Boers, the former Dutch settlers, and to ensure that there's peace between what he calls the two European races, the British settlers and the Boers. And he certainly understands the anxiety of the Boers about what he called the ever-swelling sea of dark humanity. So his position is really that he supports the principle of equal rights of civilized men, irrespective of colour. And of course, the crucial word there is civilized. How do you define it? How do you understand it? And so on. So in 1906, Gandhi and Churchill meet when Gandhi comes with a Muslim businessman into London to lobby the government on Indian rights in South Africa. Churchill, I don't think he ever referred to the encounter. Gandhi doesn't say very much. He just says in one of his pieces that Churchill spoke nicely. So we don't know much about this. But what we do know is that the meeting clearly had little effect. In 1907, South African government restricts immigration from India. It requires so-called Asiatics to register or leave, register with the government or leave. And this is pushing Gandhi into protests. And this is where he develops his policy of non-violent resistance, satyagraha, as it's called. And this is one of his first periods of several in a South African jail.
And then a big turning point comes in 1915 when Gandhi returns to India, bringing this form of protest, satyagraha, with him to his homeland and a key part of the British Empire. What is Gandhi hoping to achieve in India at this point?
Well, he's now developing this idea of nonviolent resistance and nonviolent struggle as almost a panacea, a solution for what he calls the many ills we suffer in India. He's developing also a growing sense of a kind of broad Indian national identity. He's a Hindu, but he works closely with Muslims. He's dealing with Indians speaking many different languages. What he wants at this stage is, in a sense, what people have been agitating for in Ireland in the late 19th century, home rule, much greater autonomy within the British Empire. But more than that, he wants the right kind of home rule because he has a vision of Indian society which is very different from what he's seen in Britain. In particular, what he's seen there is the effects of industrialization, the, dark satanic mills, if you like. He wants India to be self-reliant, to return to peasant and craft traditions. And that's very different from the kind of economic development being pushed by the Raj and indeed by many Indian nationalists. And so Gandhi adopts peasant dress quite deliberately as a sign of solidarity, particularly the loincloth or the dhoti, which he's now often pictured with at his spinning wheel. He sees spinning as a symbolic of the kind of craft industries that he wants to develop. For Churchill, this is utterly perverse. His conception of the British Empire is a way to take people from barbarism to civilization. Gandhi just seems to be going in the opposite direction. So this is a fundamental difference of values which underlies the other concerns about potential Indian nationalism that Gandhi's advocating. And by the early 1920s, Churchill's marked out Gandhi as a really dangerous troublemaker. He wants Gandhi deported from India, and he's quite blatant in some of his comments. At one dinner party, he says with a sort of flippant brutality, he says that Gandhi should be trampled by an elephant ridden by the Viceroy of India. That's the kind of feeling he has, the animosity that develops.
But by the late 1920s, a political consensus is forming in Britain that something has to be done to address Indian demands for greater devolution of power. And so you have a declaration by the Viceroy, Lord Irwin, which raises Indian nationalist hopes of being granted dominion status under the Crown, like Australia or New Zealand. But this caused further problems.
Yes, Gandhi is now developing his position as almost a celebrity. In March 1930, Gandhi launched what became known as the Salt March, and this was a huge event across British India. Salt was heavily taxed by the Raj, but it was readily available in vast salt pans along the Indian coast. And so this was, if you like, a staple for Indian people, but the imperial government was extracting money from that. He starts out with just a few followers, 70 or so, but he draws massive crowds as he moves around the country. And he says when he symbolically gets to pick up a lump of salt and mud, he says, with this, I am shaking the foundations of the British Empire. Wow. So this is quite a calculated act. It spurs protests, spurs boycotts of British goods, growing civil disobedience, and often that turns violent. Gandhi is arrested without trial, and by the end of the year, 60,000 Indians are in prison. So this is now a mass movement.
Yeah. And Churchill's own party was split on what to do next. Where did he stand?
Yeah. So in November 1929, Churchill sets out the changes that he feels are needed before Dominion status could be conceded to the Indians, that they've got to address the discrimination against the untouchables. They've got to bridge the racial and religious divides within India, particularly the Hindu-Muslim divide. He's also complaining about the way that the political class in India, the Congress Party, is just a tiny fraction of a population of 350 million. Yeah. And he says, we as Britain are responsible for the welfare of all those people, whereas the politicians, the Indian politicians, have got their own corrupt interests, mostly in their mind.
But he's very much out on a limb, isn't he? I mean, granting Dominion status in India now has the support of the Labour government and also the Conservative leader, critically, Stanley Baldwin.
Yeah, so there's a Labour government from 1929 to 1931, and Baldwin, as you say, the Tory leader, is in support of some measures of devolution of power to India. So in 1930, Churchill speaks out at the inaugural meeting of the Indian Empire Society, and he says Gandhiism, as he calls it, will have to be crushed, not appeased. And when, in January 1931, Gandhi is released from prison unconditionally, that's the point when Churchill resigns from the Tory front bench because he feels this is an act of appeasement by the Viceroy. Mm. Gandhi writes to the Viceroy, Lord Irwin, asking to meet. And Irwin decides that he must accept. And that really infuriates Churchill. This is like conceding a symbolic equality to the most, potent Indian opponent of British rule. And that's the meeting that leads to Churchill's sneer in the speech that he makes to his constituents in Epping about Gandhi as posing as a fakir, striding half naked up the steps of the Viceroy Palace. It's a great exaggeration, came in through the side door. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. But what Churchill's trying to do there, and it's a phrase which you quoted at the beginning, and it's often quoted, Churchill's striving for rhetorical effect, but he's also making a fundamental point, which is now characteristic of all his attitudes right through the rest of his life towards Gandhi, that this is a London-trained lawyer turned peasant agitator, and he's truly a fakir, F-A-K-E-R, playing the role of fakir. He's a con man. He's playing on the credulity of the masses, and that is something that really gets Churchill's goat.
Yeah, throughout this period in the India debates, Churchill seems at his most reactionary, really. He sounds like a man railing against the world, the way the world is changing. And this is presumably where Churchill's rather blimpish image comes from, where it emerges.
Yes, and certainly that would be the view of many in his own party. But Churchill's belief is that Britain's problem in the 1930s, this perception of the decline of British power, is essentially a failure of willpower. And if the government summons up the will and acts vigorously, it can deal with these problems. So Britain needs to take a firm line, and this tendency towards appeasement, whether it's Gandhi or Hitler, is a reflection of British politicians pandering to the electorate in what is now a really new age of mass democracy. Mm-hmm. His personal view is that the franchise has been extended beyond the limits of what is sensible, the limits of those interested, informed about politics, those with a stake in society. And he certainly hints at regret about actually letting women have the vote because of the feeling that they simply are just interested in house and home and do not take an informed view of Britain's national life. Mm. Churchill's just out on a limb with this one. Irwin, the Viceroy, doesn't agree that the Raj can be sustained in its historic form. It's got to move with the times. And he and Baldwin both agree that Churchill has lost his head about this matter. And of course, there's also the feeling that Churchill, he's now out of office. He's been out of office, government office, since 1929. And he's looking for ways of making a nuisance of himself and attracting attention to get himself back into politics, onto the front bench of the Tory party, into power, whatever it is. So there's a feeling here that Churchill is also playing a tactical game as well as blowing off steam in a reactionary way as well.
Where do you put the balance, if you like? Is it a question of principle for Churchill, or is he really seeing this as a ticket to try and steal the Tory leadership from Baldwin?
Well, I don't think it's either or. I think it's a bit of both. And I think that's true of many politicians. They want to be in office because they feel they have something that they're going to do with it, not just simply for fame or advancement or whatever. And I think Churchill is definitely blending principle and opportunism. Andrew Roberts, one of Churchill's biographers, says that Churchill made what he calls a secular religion out of the empire. This was his equivalent of Christianity that people like Irwin believed in. And Churchill has a conviction that this is absolutely central to Britain's not only power political role in the world, but its mission to improve humanity. It's that sense of moving people from barbarism to civilization. But he also feels, undoubtedly, that the mess Baldwin's got himself into over India with the Conservative Party signals the chance for Churchill to come back. This is the moment that he feels the Conservatives are perhaps moving towards him and Baldwin is on the ropes.
Then in March 1931, Gandhi calls off his civil disobedience and starts new talks with Irwin, who's backed by the Labour government of 1929 to 31 and then by the national government that succeeded it for the rest of the 1930s. And in this, Stanley Baldwin became the leading figure and soon Prime Minister. He pushes Indian devolution effectively through the Commons.
Yes, this is where Churchill now really enters the political wilderness. He's nailed his colours to the mast and he becomes more and more isolated from the Tory High Command as they push through the Government of India bill in the Commons against constant opposition by Churchill. And relations, become rather difficult. There's a amusing occasion where in 1935, Churchill goes into one of the small lavatories in the House of Commons for a pee, and Baldwin is there already sort of standing at the urinals. And so they both stand rather uneasily together. And Baldwin says, "I'm glad that there's still one platform where we can meet together." It got very difficult.
So Churchill fights the India Bill all the way, but it passes into law in 1935. You could see this as really one of Churchill's rare political failures, couldn't you?
Well, yes, that's how it may seem now to us. But then we're looking at it from the vantage point of a man whose finest hours, if you like, are ahead of him. Many people in the late 1930s thought that Churchill was one of yesterday's men, a man whose career was over. He'd been out of office for a decade, since 1929. He tries to build more bridges with the Tory leadership, but nothing changes and probably would not have changed unless another war with Germany broke out. And it's striking that Baldwin, who is as keen as anybody to keep Churchill out of government or out of the front bench of the Tory party in the 1930s, does make this comment that we need to save him as our war prime minister, because Baldwin can see that there is a possibility that war will break out. And Churchill's particular talents are much more suited to wartime than to, if you like, the drudgery of peacetime.
Yeah. And so we reach World War II. Churchill is now Prime Minister. Gandhi's unorthodox politics again become a headache. How did Gandhi greet the outbreak of war?
Well, he saw it as an opportunity to push for greater independence for India, if you like, playing off the warring powers. We need to remember that in September 1939, the Viceroy, who then is Lord Linlithgow, simply declares India to be at war with Germany. And he is speaking for these hundreds of thousands of people without consulting their politicians. Gandhi says that he personally is sympathetic to Britain and France, but the Indian Congress Party is the organization that decides policy, and it demands a British commitment to India's independence after the war, if you like, as a condition for participating in the war effort. And then when France falls in the summer of 1940, Gandhi certainly feels that Britain's day may be done. He advises the Viceroy to sue for peace. He goes out of his way to commend the courage of French statesmen who signed an armistice. He recommends non-violence in the face of Axis aggression and even of Axis invasion of Britain, which is clearly not the Churchillian line. You know, we shall fight them on the beaches, on the landing grounds, we shall never surrender. So these two men are not on the same page. And Gandhi then launches a limited campaign of civil disobedience.
Right.
He even writes to Hitler and urges him to make an effort for peace. And he says publicly, we resist British imperialism no less than Nazis.
Yeah. And the crisis deepens in 1942 after the surrender of Singapore and the invasion of Burma. This must have been the moment when the British Empire was under the greatest pressure in the whole war, from outside and also from within.
Yes, the psychological damage of the fall of Singapore was huge. Obviously, there's a military significance. It opens up the Pacific in 1942 to Japanese Navy. But the idea that what is perceived as the great British fortress in the Far East surrenders, it's not even like it's a last-ditch battle, as Churchill urged the British generals to do. But, you know, they're running out of supplies, they're running out of water and so on. They surrender. And that is psychologically a signal to Gandhi and to millions of Indians that, if you like, the Raj, the empire, hasn't got any more clothes, if you like. Its nakedness has been opened up. So Congress takes the opportunity now to announce a new non-violent mass struggle led by Gandhi. Gandhi's arrested, he's imprisoned, though relatively comfortably in a palace. The Viceroy justifies locking Gandhi up by insinuating that Congress has connections with the Axis powers. The Congress Party launches now what's called a Quit India campaign. Churchill's more and more furious. He says, I hate Indians, beastly people, he explodes on one occasion. And he is now suggesting that the Congress Party is trying to hamper the defense of India, is aided by Japanese fifth columnists and so on. So the rift is getting wider and wider and the animosity deeper and deeper. Gandhi's not released until May 1944. So while he's locked up, the Quit India campaign is led by younger radicals, and their actions fuel the violence on both sides, particularly by Hindus against Muslims. The British crackdown against the violence is pretty brutal, hundreds of deaths, thousands of arrests. It's bad for Britain's image, but it also cast doubt on the viability of Gandhi's creed of nonviolence. You know, in a way, he's losing control of the movement that he has started and promoted. And also, and particularly alarming for Gandhi, the violence gives space for the Muslim leader, Jinnah, who is supportive of the British war effort, to build up the Muslim League's political base to create a mass following, so that in a way that wasn't the case a few years before, the Muslims have a political organization comparable to the Indian National Congress from the Hindu side.
Amid all this, in 1943 to 4, we have the notorious Bengal famine. 2 to 3 million Indians die. And it's a fierce debate still. How much was Churchill involved? And was he negligent?
It is a complex issue, and it's very much a matter of debate. In some ways, it's a natural disaster, cyclones affecting the food crops and food supply. In part, it's due to the loss of Burma, an important source of Bengal's grain. Britain's also got its priorities very, very differently and very far away from the Indian famine. Shipping priorities in 1943-4 are very much about supplying and concentrating resources in Britain for D-Day, the epic landing in Normandy. So all those things go into the mix. But what's clear is that the fate of the Indian peasantry is a very remote concern as far as Whitehall's concerned. Churchill gets involved occasionally. For example, he tried to get some Australian wheat on one occasion, but his overriding preoccupation is the defeat of Hitler. And it took people who were up close and personal with the story to see what was going on. The new Viceroy, Lord Wavell, called that famine one of the greatest disasters that has befallen any people under British rule. It was something that he felt deeply ashamed of.
Wavell wants to make cautious advances on the political front too, bringing Indian leaders into an executive council if they promise to support the British war effort. Churchill stamps on that idea. So his animus towards Gandhi is really the driving thing here.
Yes, his view of Gandhi is absolutely fixed and, as I've said before, visceral, really. He just feels it in the gut. Gandhi really irritates him, infuriates him. So when Gandhi now starts in 1943 some periods of fasting to try and obtain his unconditional release, Churchill calls this bluff and sob stuff, and he speculates that Gandhi is having glucose put in his water while he's doing, as Churchill puts it, his fasting antics. Finally, in May 1944, Gandhi's released on health grounds, but Churchill is, again, pretty unsympathetic. He notes how quickly, as he puts it, Gandhi recovered afterwards. He says, this man is a thoroughly evil force.
So after 1945, Labour are in power. They move rapidly to bring in Indian independence and partition into the largely Hindu state of India and the Muslim Republic of Pakistan. By now, Churchill and Gandhi, though, are pretty much bystanders as these events unfold.
Yes, they are. So Churchill's out of office. He's leader of the opposition. He opposes the rush to independence. He predicts the carnage that will follow partition of India into the states of India itself and then East and West Pakistan, the Muslim states. But he doesn't vote against Labour policy or try to delay it. And in 1949, he sort of finds some crumbs of comfort in the decision of the new Indian Republic under the leadership of Nehru to remain in the Commonwealth. And maybe it helps that Nehru had been educated at Harrow, which was Winston's old school. But Nehru represents that sense of barbarism to civilization, which Churchill feels was the point of the British Empire. And that was the thing that he felt Gandhi had totally perverted, going the opposite way from civilization to barbarism. Gandhi also feels marginalized after World War II. He refers to partition as a spiritual tragedy, and he's also out of kilter with Nehru's conception of modern India. Nehru wants a strong state, rapid industrial development. Also, of course, now there's communal tensions which increase. There is a significant Muslim minority in India, and a much smaller one than before in British India, so that this is a more vulnerable group and more open to communal hostilities. So Gandhi picks up the effort again. He walked hundreds of miles trying to calm the strife. And eventually in January 1948, he is assassinated. He's killed by a Hindu nationalist in the process of trying to calm the tensions. So martyrdom makes Gandhi into a national symbol, and that symbolism is used to the full by Nehru, despite their very basic fundamental differences when Gandhi was actually alive.
And Churchill makes no comment at all about Gandhi's assassination. His hatred of Gandhi was obviously quite enduring.
Yes, it's striking. I mean, there are a lot of comments, certainly from the Labour Party, about Gandhi and the respect they have for him and so on. Churchill, I haven't been able to find any comments that he makes. As to the hatred, yes, it's there in some of those draft speeches in March 1943 that he didn't deliver. You know, he says, for 10 years before the war, I warned our British people against Hitler and Gandhi. There they are again, almost locked together in his mind as Britain's mortal enemies of the British Empire.
I was struck by a quote that you reference in your book, Mirrors of Greatness, from South African leader Jan Smuts. He said that Gandhi was similar to dictators who overwhelm the public mind, not by reason, but by play on the emotions, many of them of an irrational character. Smuts also said that Gandhi had a spiritual dimension that Churchill couldn't recognize because of his own lack of religious faith, his secular rationalism, if you like. Did Churchill have, do you think, a failure of imagination when it came to Gandhi, and what made Gandhi powerful?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, very basic ways, Churchill simply could not understand Gandhi. If you think of some of the things we've been talking about, he dismisses Gandhi's peasant dress, his fasting as hypocritical. He presents the fasts as farce, F-A-R-C-E, another sign of the way he thinks of Gandhi as the fakir, the con man. So, there is an absolutely rooted skepticism about Gandhi's sincerity. He thinks that Gandhi's deliberately reverted to barbarism, rejecting British civilization and what Churchill feels are the rights that come with that, the rights and responsibilities that come with civilization. And Churchill is at root a soldier with a profound sense of masculinity. Gandhi's loincloth, the shawl, the spinning, they all seem feminine. Mm-hmm. And that challenges Churchill's creed of manliness, of martial manliness, really, soldier prowess. But what's striking is that Gandhi's approach, his self-sacrifice, has immense moral power. And his example inspires other movements. It has, for example, a considerable effect on Martin Luther King's civil rights campaigns in the US in the 1960s. But all that is a far cry from Churchill's kind of politics. Mm. And I would say that, like Martin Luther King, Gandhi understands the power of powerlessness. And that is something alien, perhaps totally incomprehensible, to a man like Churchill, who was a graduate of Sandhurst Military Academy.
You've been listening to David Reynolds and Russell Barnes in Creating Churchill. Please rate, review, and recommend our show on your favorite podcast app. Follow us at @creating_hist on X or Instagram, and send us your comments and questions by email to info@clearstory.co.uk. Creating History is produced and edited by Russell Barnes, with music by Rich Farnsworth, digital marketing by Lee Mann, and sound engineering by Andrew Chappell. Creating Churchill is a Clear Story, Creating History production.